Hi, I'm Ray Missigman, and I'm so happy to be back with Stencil Girl again today with two new stencils, the Vintage Rose Floral Sampler and the Vintage Daisy Floral Sampler. And I am so excited to share these with you because they make the most interesting stencils as far as using them for mixed media, in the sense that you can paint through them or stitch through them or do all sorts of things with them to really get a full mixed media experience out of them. So let me show you the stencils first, and mine are nice and blue from the project we're going to be creating. This is the Vintage Rose sampler, and I just love this. It has a lot of big openings that I envision using a long satin stitch with. Also for mixed media, easy to paint through using an artist sponge and acrylic paint. You could also use a big flat wash brush and use watercolor through these. So lots of different ways that you can get your mixed media experience through this stencil. The next one is the Vintage Daisy Floral Sampler. And this one is a little bit more intricate in that the lines are smaller, so you'll get a truer stitching experience when you paint this on fabric and stitch, especially if you like to do loose or small art mark stitches when you're actually embroidering. But I want to tackle a project today that deals with paint, because I think it's important that we reach our painting artists, because they're our true mixed media people. And then if you want to tackle stitching later, you can give that a try. And we'll talk about that when I talk about the fabric. So let's look at the samples I have here. This is the Daisy Floral Sampler, and I just have a portion of it stamped onto fabric. This is just cotton muslin, and I've used the jelly plate or a printing plate to get the fabric painted up so that I could stitch over it. I love using the blue and white because it's a faux cyanotype look, and I really like that. It's very cool to use if you plan on stitching in the future, because you can leave parts of your piece painted and stitch over other parts. So perhaps I'll leave the dark, deep, moody background and stitch over these lighter blue elements. Or vice versa, I could just fill in around this. Or I can use it as a jumping off point and leave it truly mixed media by keeping the painted areas and maybe just stitching little art marks where I see all of these little dots and dashes. Here is what the Vintage Rose Floral Sampler looks like. I'm going to keep it landscape so you can see it on camera. This is the full 9x12 stencil, and again I've used my printing plate to get this really cool vintage sampler look. Again, I could use this in my mixed media pieces and add the element of a tactile stitch where I see art marks or little centers of flowers, that sort of thing, or I can keep it painted and it still give me the feel of a vintage sampler. And that's what I was really going for with these stencils. Here, this was on vintage ledger paper, by the way, if you're wondering. I had a little bit in my stash and it was perfect size for this. This is the Vintage Daisy Floral Sampler. And I've again used the printing plate, but I've used the wet strength tissue paper as my substrate. I love the sound it gives. It gives me a little bit of a more rustic look because of the crinkle and the wrinkle in the paper. And I like this for collaging an embroidered looking element into my journal or onto my canvas. So if you're not going to do true stitching, but you want to kind of get that look, the tissue paper, or you could use a deli paper, will give you that really interesting sampler look. Here are some of the ghost prints from when I used the printing plate. I love this element. I never toss these. I keep these. Sure, they are not the perfect impressions of the stencils, but they make wonderful collage elements, and they make great substrates for coming back in with your stencil and adding something over the top. So I could pull another color in, or I could pull a contrasting black or white in and go right over the tops of these and have those interesting, moody, very vintage looking backgrounds, and then a focal point using the stencil once again. These are really, really cool pieces to keep the ghost prints. And here's another one. And I get these just by cleaning off my plate as I'm working. Here's another one, cleaning the brayer and the plate. Again, you get lots of interesting layers. Here is a reverse print of the one I showed you a minute ago. So here we have the dark blue and the white flowers popping out from the stencil. Here I've reversed it and used the black background and given the white top layer. This gives more of an ethereal look, very vintage wallpaper kind of looking, whereas this I see the full sampler look. So lots of different ways that you can do that. And this one I wanted to show you, even though there's not much to see, it's the very, very, very last ghost impression of the stencil, and you're just getting a small outline of things here and there. This would be a great piece to start on to bring your stencil back over the top, or to layer other stencils to get some of those impressions before you start adding it into your journal. And if you turn it into the light, you can see more of that stencil showing up. So don't throw away your ghost prints. So we're going to go ahead today and try to recreate both the painted mixed media sampler look for those of us who want to keep it truly mixed media and have something paper to add to our journals, but still kind of give us the impression of those old floral samplers. And then we are also going to try to recreate something small, a small portion of the stencils on a scrap of fabric, so that if you want to in the future, you can try testing out stitching or melding your stitches with your paint to get a true mixed media presence there. Now this first one's pretty straightforward. It's just layering some paints. It looks more interesting if you use contrasting colors, so you can experiment with that in a palette that you're familiar with or like. I'm gonna work with the Payne's Gray again so that I can kind of recreate this for you on camera. You can use any kind of paint you want. I like a little bit heavier bodied paint for this because it stays open on the plate a little bit longer, but it's sort of a guessing game, or actually an experiment in practice for how much paint you need. You don't want it to be real thick or your paper is going to slide around, but you don't want it so transparent that you don't get that depth of color for your second layer. So I've just added a good sized dollop onto the printing plate. I'm using a 9x12 plate because I'm using a 9x12 stencil. You can use a smaller plate if you're just going to work with a portion of your stencil, and that's fine too. I do that a lot. So I'm just smoothing that paint out to get a nice even coating on my plate, and then I'm going to go ahead and take my piece of paper and lay it on the plate to just pull up all that color. And you can use a burnishing tool or your hand or the back of your brayer to really kind of pull up a lot of that paint. I'm working with mixed media paper today, so it's thicker than cardstock, but it doesn't have the texture of a watercolor paper. And you can kind of just lift the edges to see if you're getting most of the paint. My plate is old, and I like that I don't always get a perfect pull of color or impression, because for me, that's part of that vintage look. So here is the blue. What you see here are past ghost impressions of stencils, but more likely it's the small variations in the surface of my plate because I've been using it a long time. And because my paint was the right viscosity on the plate, by the time I pulled the print, I'm not having to let it dry very much. That's the other nice part about using mixed media paper. So the next thing I want to do is get that look of the white for the sampler. So I'm going to add white to my plate next. And I'm just going to use this craft acrylic white paint. I am not cleaning my paint off because this is going to blend with my white a little bit and give me the little bit of tint to that white so it blends nicely with my blue. Depending on how much paint is on your plate, after you pull, you can pull a ghost print of the blue, even though there's no stencil there to get an impression of. You will get a nice background for a second day, so you have some colorful backgrounds to print on. So you can see that as I thin the paint out, you can see a couple things. One, the blue that was left on the plate is definitely tinting my white, and I'm okay with that. And you can see all the variations in my plate. So now that that's down, I'm going to lay my stencil on the plate and just tap it down in a few areas, not through an opening because you don't want to disturb the paint that's under there, but you want to make sure there's no air bubbles so you don't pull it up when you pull your print. And then you're going to lay your paper back down. Do your best not to let it shift at this point, or you will get what looks to be like a blurred line with your stencil pull. I can show you an example of that. It doesn't look bad, it just gives you that blurry effect. And you can brayer it a little because now you're having to really push through the openings of the stencil to get a good impression. So I'll go over that a few times. And then I'll pull it up carefully so I don't blur it. And there we have a really cool vintage stencil print. And I just love how it reflects the old world style of floral samplers. I think it's really, really cool. And the added benefit for me of using these colors is it looks like a cyanotype, which I really love. So now let's try one of these on fabric. Real quick before we do the fabric, I want to show you what I mean by the blurring. So this was my really good, nice impression, my sample I showed you before we started. And here's one where the paper shifted ever so slightly. And you can see there's like a double impression in certain places, mostly at the bottom of the stencil here, almost like a little shadow of sorts. So nothing that I would toss, but it's not quite as crisp because I somehow moved the paper when I was pulling the print. So that's something to keep in mind. So now I'm gonna clean my plate off. But before I do that, I'll pull up my stencil. There's wet paint on the back, so I will clean that off. And I will get another piece of paper to pull this ghost print. And if you want to use the ghost prints for collage elements or whatnot, you don't have to use one large piece of paper. You can pull in some smaller pieces. You can pull in some scraps. I happen to have all this newsprint on hand, so I'll do that. And we'll see if we can get a lot of that ghost print pulled up. The color was very light, so it might not show up as wonderfully on this newsprint as the dark blue would. But it is a cool layer to use. Now, I love these because I would go back in and I would paint within the lines of this stencil. I'd add my own continuous marks and pen and pencil lines. You could cut pieces out and collage over it. There's a ton of things you can do with these open spaces on these ghost prints. And here's another one. And you can just get the faint impressions of flowers. I love it. When you're using a dark color, on your printing plate, it will stain, and that's okay. You can take a wipe to it. I like to leave it because then what pops through subsequent layers is really awesome. If you want to clean it even further, you can just add another touch of paint to the plate. And while it's wet, go ahead and pull, and it should help you get up even more of those under layers of paint. You can also use a damp paper towel or cloth or even a baby wipe to clean. And if you really need a deep clean, you could use a little bit of baby oil. So I'm just going to use a couple sheets of copy paper to see if I can clean the plate even further. And we got some more ghost prints. Less definition to those images or elements because we had a lot of layers we were working with. But I really love them. They remind me of kind of an old fresco or really, really old wallpaper you would see somewhere. And the dark outlines are cool. So I would save all of these ghost prints. And I think that's plenty clean for moving on to our fabric sample. So to give this one a try, we're going to do similar steps and see if we can pull something crisp on fabric like this. Okay, so I've gone ahead and cut a piece of fabric. This is just the unbleached cotton muslin again. And one thing I wanted to mention is that these make really cool pages in your art journal. I mean, you can fold them in half and stitch them in like you would a regular page. You can cut them out and stitch them to a page. You can stitch elements or little pieces that you cut out. You can tape them in as flap-ins. Lots of things to do. So even if you don't think you want to embroider, don't discount the fact that you could work on fabric and add them into your mixed media journals because they're really, really super cool. So I've gone ahead and moved down to the 6x6 square plate so that I can get a nice square on my fabric. And I always like to point this out. If you are going to give the stitching a try, make sure that you cut your fabric bigger than your hoop. So you wouldn't want to come in and then put your fabric in your hoop and it be smaller than your hoop size. So make sure you're always cutting your fabric bigger than your hoop if you plan on stitching. And the first thing I'm going to do is go back to this blue Payne's gray because I really like the contrast of that background. And I'm going to add that to the plate. Again, kind of working it out into an even layer. This plate has a lot of bumps and divots on it. So we're going to get some really cool lines and marks from that as well. And then I'm going to take my fabric and I'm just going to center it over the plate. You can iron it first. You don't have to. I typically don't. And I'm going to smooth it. Depending on how thick you've applied the paint, it may or may not seep through in a few places, and that's okay. And then I can peek to make sure I'm getting most of that paint picked up, and I am. And I have a nice, cool, dark background. And you can see some of these little marks and squiggles and wrinkles are actually in my plate. So that's what those are coming from. So it's some added interest there. Now the next thing I'm going to do is put some white on the plate. And if you want a nice crisp image, you can first pull a ghost print to get rid of some of this blue. I'll do that with you this time. I typically don't, but you can see between my brayer and the plate, I have quite a bit of blue left. So I can pull that up. And my original piece did show a lot of blue and not just white. So I have a scrap here. I'm just going to use to pull up this paint. And that cleaned a lot of the blue off the plate and gave me some more beautiful collage paper. So once you have your block of blue, we'll get ready to do the white. But I want to be able to line this up on the plate when I do the white, and I don't have that tool. So I'm going to go ahead and take the excess fabric and I'm going to pin it out of the way so that I can line up my square of blue over the white impression of the stencil. So I'll just pin the extra edges to itself. And that way my square will land on the plate a little bit more evenly for me to see. And that way I can get a good impression. So now I'm going to add some white to the plate. I'm going to get a good amount of the paint on there and move that around. And then I'm going to take my stencil and I'm just going to randomly select an area. I find that I like that better than kind of hashing out where things are going to go. And then I'm going to look through the stencil and see where my plate is and line up my blue square. And then I can even put a piece of scrap paper over it and kind of brayer that fabric down, at least to start, and then I can burnish it with my hands. It really wouldn't matter if I got paint on this because it's not going to show even if I stitch it because it's the outer edges, but I like to preserve that in case I change avenues and decide to use it in my journal or anything. So it's a little bit harder with the small openings to get a perfect impression. So I'm making sure I'm really pushing down on that design. And there we have a really pretty cool looking little, not only does it look like a cyanotype, but it really looks like a vintage floral sampler. Whether we stitch it or not, this would be gorgeous in a journal. Now I have this print here, this ghost print, so I'm going to go ahead and pull it up so I can put it in my collage stash. And that's a really nice ghost print too. So you see we're collecting all of these other materials along the way, even if they're just that we're cleaning our brayer off of. If I were to use really dark paint and put the stencil on this, it would be super cool. So I just keep collecting all of these for layers. So let's go ahead and take a look at the pieces we made. So I was really excited to share a couple ways with you today that are really quick and really easy for you to get that appearance of a vintage sampler into your artwork, whether it be with paper or fabric, whether you're stitching or collaging or just plain old stenciling, it can be beautiful. This is nothing but the most basic technique of stenciling, and I think it really is reminiscent of a vintage sampler. I picture it on a tea towel or wallpaper or something, even if it isn't stitched. And so I think this will make a beautiful journal cover or some interesting pages in my mixed media journal. And then this one, I can't wait to add it to my hoop and get stitching it. I think that I'm going to do what I talked about originally and maybe create some variation in the texture by leaving some paint and some stitches. But if I wanted to, now I have two that are similar, so I could create some fabric covers for a journal or something as well. And again, maybe all of those ghost prints could be the pages or something. So I'll be interested to see where you guys take this. Now, as far as in my journal, I happen to have a little journal that I love. It was great for this project. I made it a while ago. It just happens to coincide with my color scheme, so I like that. But I have in here collaged a few of the ghost prints that I had. And then I stenciled right over them, just plain old basic stenciling, and added some marks with a white pen and nothing else. I haven't journaled or done anything else. It's a very flat page, but it has depth in that it has layers, and it is giving me that reminiscent feel of old world embroidery samplers. So I hope you have fun with these projects. I really am excited to see what you do. And if you have any questions, you're always welcome to reach out to me at raymissigman.com. I'm also on social media at raymissigman. So have fun, and I can't wait to see what you do. Happy creating.